Well, thank you and welcome, and we hope today that we can share with you some information about TMAs. Some of you may be doing those, and some may not. Some may wish to do them. They are a lot of fun. They are a lot of work, primarily for things that you do in the very beginning, or certainly if you're using them for controls or validation, they're a lot of work to do up front, but it makes everything that you do after that so much better. Okay, so if we wanted to define what an array is, just basically by definition, and these are just definitions that I primarily put together, an arrangement or collection of a specific item or items. Then this is a slide that's showing eggs of butterflies. That's part of my hobbies is collecting antique slides. This was prepared sometime about mid-1800s. And this is an array of butterfly eggs. They're very gorgeous. They're put in some order, in some detail. They're grouped together to make a wonderful array to visually look at and to study in some type of form. We have another type of definition. It is like a grouping or a gathering. This slide is a slide of hummingbird feathers that is prepared also in the same time period. And as you can see, the way that they're grouped together gives you such a visual appearance and one that allows you to
Lamar,
study.
are you still there?
Yes, I'm here. Do you not hear me?
You're breaking up really bad.
Oh, well.
There you go. You're back.
Is that better? Okay.
Okay.
But anyway, this is an array or gathering or grouping of something that you can study. In this particular example, it's the hummingbird feathers. So if we define further, it is an assortment of tissue cores, squares, or other configurations to demonstrate a single source of tissue specimens to provide an economical and scientific method for an assay of an H&E stain, a special stain, IHC and or ISH expressions, and molecular diagnostic methods. The history begins, somewhat at least, in 1986 when multi-tissue sausage blocks were created by Dr. Hector Batafora, MD, was a pathologist, and he created some array slides, and he described it as a better method to embed a large number of tissue samples in a single paraffin block. The tissues these can be arranged in a form of a checkerboard or grid-like pattern. Even sometimes these blocks were made by taking tissues in a stick form and then wrapping them with sausage casing or even a placenta membrane that would then serve as a uniqueness way to hold them together so they could process and then be embedded in a paraffin block. There was another unique method that you could cut tissue sections into a linear stick as such and process in a single cassette. And after the paraffin infiltration, the tissues are coated with paraffin. The sticks could then be placed in a box that is labeled with proper identification and stored until ready for use. So then when you decide to make a block, you could go and select a stick from this box of tissue cores, and you could cut them and make the type of array block that you particularly want, whether it be for IHC or validation studies, H&E, or the list could go on. So why TMAs? These can be primarily used for standardization, conservation of tissue. They're relatively easy to use, and of course validation, which we are in so much involving our work today to validate antibodies, special stains, procedures, and the list could go on. The purpose then is the collection of different tumors, validation of IHC antibodies, controls for IHC and special stains, molecular and genomics, and cancer research. And particularly the last two are of high importance today in our laboratories, and the use of TMAs are very handy for this. Utilization, the uniqueness of technology can allow pathologists and researchers to evaluate numerous tissues at one time. And depending upon the size of the tissue cores, certainly a wide range of these tissue specimens can be placed in a single tissue block. So prognostic, prevalence, and experimental. So we'll talk about each one of those, beginning with progression first. The progression contains samples of different stages of a particular tissue, such as normal or tumor types, and it can provide associations between tumor genotype and phenotype. And continuing on, breast progression TMA samples, for example, can provide things like normal breast tissue with and without tumor, different non-neoplastic breast diseases, ductal and lobular carcinoma in situ, invasive cancers, grades and histologic subtypes, as well as metastasis and recurrences after initial successful treatment. Then we'll move on to prognostic. These type of arrays will contain samples from tumors with available clinical follow-up data. They represent a rapid and reliable platform for the evaluation of clinical importance, certainly of a newly detected disease or related genes, and most importantly, validation studies that will use prognostic TMAs. So this would be a very valuable tool in your IHC department. The third one, prevalence, will contain tumor samples of one or more types without attached clinical or pathological data. These are kind of useful to determine the prevalence of a given alteration in tumor entities of a particular interest. And then the last one of the group is experimental. And this can be constructed from tissues such as cell lines or tumors from archives, which is used for a lot of research purposes and can be used for validation purposes as well. Now, the tissue microarray design, its importance is to design and construct a TMA to build a simple arrangement of a specified number of tissue samples in one or more blocks. You have two types of blocks: high density, that has a large number of tissues in a 37 by 24 by 5 millimeter block. A low density is a smaller number of tissues, and that would be a 24 by 24 by 5 millimeter block. Now, there are several types of instruments out there to make the arrays. They're both manual and automated, and I've listed some here for you to see. The one on the immediate left is one that's very manual, and for most purposes in most places that's probably the one of choice. The one in the middle is a relatively newer design, and it does very well. The one on the far right is an automated system that would have a computer tied to it with software, and would be certainly a little bit more precise and consistent, and would perform a few more arrays than the manual method. And then the bottom row on the immediate left is more like a plunger type or punch type of instrument that will make the array cores. And then on the immediate right would be another type of system that would make that would include every little tool. We're going to discuss this a little later in the presentation for making your array blocks as well. So there are many ways of doing it. I will tell you that I used to make arrays for my students and teaching them to do a lot of biopsies back in the 1980s. Though I didn't put this on the presentation, I used a Jamshidi bone marrow needle, which gave us a pretty decent core. But you know, that's been quite a while. But there are many ways of making your arrays. You just have to find one, work with it, learn its idiosyncrasies, and how to perfect it to making your array work for you. Along the lines of manual arrays, the visual selection of tissue sample removal is constructed by you and with the aid of a magnifier. Because these cores are relatively small, it would be helpful to have some form of magnification to let you see what you're doing a little more accurately and not tire your eyes out entirely. Operation movement is performed by you, the technologist, and can produce 30 to 70 cores per hour depending upon the experience of the technologist. Probably in the beginning you're not going to get that speed, but the more you do it, the more proficient that you become. It's an education process for you to gain the experience and the speed in which to get these accomplished in a short period of time. Automated, it has a special specimen tracking software. It will actually mark, edit, and save punches using an on-screen display, which is a pretty nice feature. The operation is computer controlled, and it can produce 120 to 180 core punches per hour. That's quite rapid, and they're pretty precise. This will eliminate fatigue and the possible carpal tunnel syndrome that we hear so much about with the work that we all do in histology. Ergonomically, the automated is certainly a better way to go. And the last but not least is usually fairly consistent. So the components of simple manual arrayer are things like the depth stop. It has a unique feature that it would not allow you to go too deep in making the punches and or the holes in the block that you're putting the cores into. So it's a neat feature. You have small needles as well as large needles. You have set screws for holding the array block style in place. Spring clip turret, which helps as well, and a donor block bridge, which you will see that in just a moment. The needle sizes then are as follows. There's 0.6, 1, 1.5, and 2 millimeter cores. Now, for the ones that I usually make for our controls, because I like to be able to see a little more tissue there for control purposes, are usually made at 2 millimeters. There's a unique way I didn't really include images of this, but I'm happy to share it with you. If you're certainly on a very, very low budget, one of the 2 millimeter derm punches, if they actually take punch biopsies of skin that has a little stylus in it, is a good little tool, or certainly if you're making one very quickly, you can take cores with this derm punch, and they're 2 millimeters, which are a very good size. This is just showing the core size and the grid and the number of cores that you can normally get. And then you can see on the immediate right in the corner an array, H&E stain that's just showing all of the cores that are lined up. It's really something that's pretty neat, very nicely organized, and we're going to talk about the construction of these and show you that it's not really a difficult challenge to do. It is tedious. It is a little time, but the rewards are considerably advantageous. So it all starts with taking H&E slides. They need to be reviewed to determine what specific area of the tissue section is to be taken for the TMA. The value in having a TMA is that you don't have things like adipose tissue or collagen and connective tissue if you don't need that. If you're doing this study for tumors or controls or things like that, you're more interested in maybe a specific area or entity than the entire tissue section. So you would take the tray of slides, and usually this is done by pathologist, a resident, and in many cases a histotech, depending on what you're using to accomplish and what your goal is here. And you'll look at the slide under the microscope and pick the area of interest. Then you will pull the blocks and also take a look at the block and see, is there really enough tissue for me to take a core? Has it been cut down very thin, or is it still a lot left in the block? And that will be something you'll have to determine, perhaps with you and your pathologist or resident. But you will match it up with the block, and then you will circle that area of interest once you look under the microscope and determine where you want to take a core or cores, whichever the case may be. Then you can mark that area of interest with a distinguished different color. For example, and these colors are not set in stone by no means, but cancer could be red, normal tissue could be green, and pre-invasive could be black. So you may select the area and determine what's going where in the TMA. You can color code it by using the type of ink there to highlight it. The correct block then is matched with the H&E slide. By all means, that's something that we need to do, is to be sure the identity, both the slide and the block, match. It's easy to pick up the wrong one if it can look alike or whatever, and be sure that you have exactly what you're wanting to make the array up. You'll take the slide and place it directly over the paraffin block and properly match up in the area of interest, as you've already seen in the prior slide. So the donor block. This is the block from which the tissue sample is taken. It's the block that's either archived tissue, surgical tissue, whatever it is, and they're going to give up a core or cores in order for you to make this new block, which will be the TMA. The recipient block is a blank paraffin block that will serve as the tissue microarray block. So most likely you're going to choose an in-between or a mid-size embedding block, or the very large, because you certainly are going to have a lot of space to make these, and you don't need to be a very small block. They need to be a very good-sized block. So the map or grid is prepared. You're going to see the grid in just a moment. The TMAs must be maintained by thorough organization. You've got to maintain some type of identity, organization throughout this entire process, or all of your work is not going to be very well justified. If it's just for control, I think you can get by with a little less, but if you're doing this for specific study or research or even patient care, which these are becoming more and more involved in patient care today, then you're going to have to maintain a type of identity organization. The map or grid will serve as the guide or documentation of the actual location of the tissue sample. We'll see that in just a moment. The grid, once it's constructed, can be squares or oval-shaped grids where the identification of the samples are actually recorded. So in order to do this, you're going to have a little bit of space that's dedicated for you to do this work, so you can place your trays of slides and your blocks and have your grid so you can record the case numbers in it as you're actually doing this. Now, here's the grid pattern. It's very simple, and as I said, they can be either squares or they can be ovals, and so you can place numbers, letters, it doesn't matter which, so that you can identify the area. But you'll need to have a reference point, which I'll mention this again, in some place or corner, so that you'll have some beginning point that you'll be able to reference each time. So if you see A here, and that whole row will be A, and the numbers at the top will correspond with the square, so that you have a way to identify what you're actually constructing. The next slide is showing you now where you have actually recorded a case number, in A1, which is S102496. Then when you make the next one, you'll get A2, right? And you'll just keep this process going until it's complete. This grid will need to be maintained with this array block so that whenever you're looking at the slides that you've stained or identified or having IHC performed or whatever, you'll have some identification method to tell you what tissue is going on or is there. Now, the next grid is showing you where we've got different types of tissue, and in the bottom corner you'll see the breast carcinoma cell lines, and you can see what they would look like microscopically. But this grid is showing you the different types of tissue that's probably used for control. You may have some normal, you may have some tumor. And as we all know, our controls for IHC should have a combination of one or the other or both. But this is just a sample grid, and the grids do not have to be very large. The TMAs do not have to be very large. It depends on the purpose for what you're going to utilize them for. For example, for the controls that we use for our IHC, I probably only make about 8 to 10 cores. And for example, I may want to make a CD marker block, and I may make the array block that I can use. Now, there must be a starting point before, such as a colored square or an oval or even a notch in one corner of the grid, and to serve as your reference point or beginning. The tissue types or samples continued in this format as you continue to make the array itself. Therefore, when you have to stop for some reason, you at least know where you are and perhaps what you have completed. You may shoot or you have to leave the room, so you'll know exactly where you are when you return. Now, on construction, a recipient block is prepared. It's just a regular blank paraffin block. Now, this block is going to have to be practically perfect or error-free. Because of the work you're going to do with it, you don't want any imperfections there. It should be solid. It should be free of bubbles and holes or even cracks. Usually a soft paraffin is recommended, and I just listed one here, the Paraplast Extra, because as you begin to make these holes and you're putting the punches and punching out the holes, they're going to be close together, so you've got to be sure that this is not going to crumble around each particular core. The appropriate size punch then is selected depending upon the size of the cores and the TMA block that you're going to construct. A reference point then is established, and then you will maintain that reference point. I can't emphasize that enough, because as you begin to make these blocks, this will come back as, okay, I need a reference point, I need a beginning point. So you really can't emphasize that overly enough. This is a manual array setup. It's showing you the array system. You've got a magnifier there that you can use that has a light in it that will enable you to see the cores and see better what you're doing as you're placing them into the holes. Then you have a recipient block, which is an orange cassette, as you're seeing it placed into the holder and tightened down with the set screws so that it's held in place. And it's like anything else that we're doing in histology, as far as orientation is concerned, you'll need to make these where you put the block in the same way every time so that your block is constructed the same way every time. It's a little more precise, and we just need to become useful to that as we're making our array blocks. Now, this is the recipient block here, which is a block of just paraffin. You're seeing the block as it's well seated into the arrayer, and that's if you use an arrayer system. You'll actually see the punches, And if you look very closely, you'll see the paraffin that's been lifted out. It looks like a little round core. It's still basically in the edge of the needle. So you would, press this needle down. It's hollow, and it will take out a core of paraffin, so it leaves a very nice, precise little hole. And then that's when we're going to add the core of tissue in just a moment. The bridge is no more than just a little square block of covering, if you want to call it that then is placed over the recipient block. This is so that you can take the donor block, which is the block that has your tissue, you place it on the bridge, you lower the needle down into the area of interest, and it actually will take a core of tissue out and hold it in place. Then you'll actually move the bridge away and drop this tissue core into the hole that you've already made. And that's what we've pretty much done here. If you'll see that little brown spot on A1, and if you look, that we've actually taken some tape to label this recipient block, and we've labeled the numbers at the top and the letters on the side so that we're able to configure our little grid right there on the arrayer itself. And so you drop the core of tissue in the hole, and it kind of is seated there until you finish the process, which we'll be going over a little later in the presentation. So if you note, the end of the cassette is identified, cassette in, as you see written on the tape, the numbers, and then on the side you'll notice that the letters corresponding with the numbers as well. So a quick ray is a fairly unique little system that is very helpful for making the arrays. You have 4 different size tips that are here that can be taken and replaced to the end of the plunger, you may call it. It has a very unique mold there, embedding mold, which will tell you how that's used momentarily. And then you've got 4 nice little packages of cores included. These will serve as an insert, so to speak, that you will actually place your cores of tissue down in, and you'll place the little core set into the embedding mold, and you'll place the cores in the hole there corresponding with a grid or some form of identification. And these little quick ray inserts come in several sizes. You can have some that will have 120 cores, some will have 20, some will have 60. It makes it nice depending on the particular array that you are going to construct. Not all arrays will need to have a lot of cores. You may find some to be very useful with like the 60 or the 20 or the 120. It just depends on what your purpose is going to be. So here's what the little inserts look like once you've added the tissue to them. They're nicely designed little holes, and you just drop the tissue in, and then of course you place this in the embedding mold, and we'll see what happens momentarily with that. This is actually the quick ray punch that's taken the core tissue. And this probably is about a 2mm punch or so, and so you're getting a very generous piece of tissue out of the block. And yes, it does leave a hole when you're done with it. This is another schematic showing you the array block. And if you'll take a look at the very top of this block, you'll see that reference point. And this person chose to have one core outside of the top of the array as their reference point. And again, that's something you can be creative and choose the area that you want to serve as a reference point. This is just showing a block that have had the cores removed. You can see it looks well, pretty well absorbed. It's had lots of cores taken for whatever purpose. And so yes, there will be holes left. If you go back to make a recut, if you can recut it, you'll have lots of little holes. And I put an image here showing you the core holes in the H&E. So for whatever reason and for whatever study that was done, then the cores have been taken and have left a void. Now, if example, we were talking about earlier that if your tissue is thin and you do take cores from it, there's nothing wrong with taking them from thin sections, except you will probably have to take two and place one on top of another in the recipient block so that you'll have enough tissue to make one full core once you drop the tissues into the holes itself. So you may have to stack them on top of each other to make one good core if the tissue is extremely thin. This repetitive motion is continued until the TMA block is completely prepared. Upon completion, then you'll actually take this block and you will place it in a 60-degree oven with a plain glass slide over the cores. If you take a look, this image is a little dark, but you can see that a slide has actually been placed over the cores to keep them flat and to provide a flat surface as this block begins to melt together. Now, this is a very critical point. You don't want it to stay in there too long. It's hard for me to tell you what's too long because I'm not sure what type of paraffin you're using. You may be using a hard paraffin, you may be using a short, a soft paraffin. So either way, you're going to have to kind of time it. You don't want this to thoroughly melt. You just want it to begin to melt so that it fuses together the paraffin holes and the cores of tissue so that they will remain in a upright on-end position. So again, this is something you'll have to test in your laboratory. Just to give you a time gauge, you're probably looking at 15 minutes. I would start checking certainly after 15 minutes and determine what your endpoint will be. Now, once your paraffin has begun to melt and it adheres to the tissue cores, you'll want to remove it from the oven and place it in a freezer to solidify just like you would any other paraffin block so that you have maintained its stability and it is solid. Then what will happen is you'll just take the slide off and it comes off very, very nicely. The cores should not stick to it at all because they're well adhered together in the paraffin block. Microtomy. Well, after the TMA block is prepared, it can be sectioned just as any other tissue block. You should carefully face it. You'll have to remember these are going to be tiny cores, so you should treat them as cutting a tiny biopsy. You don't want to face into it too quickly, or rather with a lot of depth, so that you'll cut away your little cores because they are very tiny. So you should not have any trouble. If it's tissue that's been overly processed, as we may say, that may need a little soaking, you may need to face it and then let it soak a little bit. That's the method that you utilize. The thing about it is you're having lots of characteristic of tissue in that one block. You may have hard, fibrous connective tissue against some very soft, porous tissues, some dense tissues, some hard tissues, some soft tissues. So it's an array of different types of tissue that you'll have to section very carefully so that you get a nice section of each and you don't have a lot of microtomy artifacts. Then I've just given you a few examples here. This is TMA block in the top left, and I put a little arrow showing that that person there used a different type of reference point. It's more like a cross pattern, and that just gives them a good reference point. It worked well for them. That may be something you may choose to do. You'll notice in here the different varieties of tissue. You have some that are very dark, which might be spleen or something like that. Some that are very light, which can have a lot of collagen and connective tissue in them. The list could go on. Then in the other part of the very right side of the slide, you'll see TMA slides. You'll see the different hole or punch sizes. The first one I think is a 1 millimeter. The second one is 1.5. The third is 2. And the last one is a 4 millimeter. So you can see the size punches that you can select for the purpose of your arrays that you're wanting to make. The bottom row just shows different purposes. You can use them for H&E. The H&E array can be used to scan the types of tissue that's in there for immunohistochemistry staining or any other type of staining. You can use these for special stains. You don't always have to make a core necessarily. For example, that I like to make some for special stains. Let's just take trichrome. We know that we use liver for trichrome. We may use gastric tissue for trichrome, or skin, or something else. So you could make nice little square blocks, if you will, or even do the cores if you choose for trichrome staining, and get the different levels of intensity for staining, which makes pretty good control. I would never use infectious material in an array, and I'll tell you why. Our microorganism controls are very precious. We don't come across them very often. So if you have a very unique fungus or bacteria that you're using, whether it be for special stains or immunohistochemistry, you'd hate to kind of put it in an array block, at least in my opinion, and cut it away every time, even though you may be using it for infectious stains. You don't need to exhaust it. So I still use a single or no more than two infectious or microorganism disease tissues for control slides. IHC would be very similar. You don't want to use, like if you have a Reed-Sternberg cell, or tissues that have Reed-Sternberg cells in them, you wouldn't want to exhaust that with a lot of other tissues for just general immunohistochemistry. You want to save those for your CD15 or CD30 specifically, and just use one piece. So an array does have some disadvantages. They're very few, and that's one of them. But the advantages of using them, I think, outweigh the disadvantages. So then there's lots of literature out there that is almost a great tool today and a great resource of any journal you pick up will practically have some method of an array block in them, whether it be a tissue microarray, or if you're into heavy research that you're using for a lot of molecular testing, you may see DNA arrays or things that are using other molecular tests. So they're more than just tissue microarrays, but of course in histotechnology, that's our prime source, is the tissue. But literature is available. Journals contain a lot of good information. Like, for example, I just saw one recently where someone made a melanoma tissue microarray. And so that helped them to study different types of tumors from, or melanoma tumors from different time periods, or archive tissue, or the list could go on. Now, if we take a look, and here is an IHC an example where you see some breast markers here, or even some that have EGFR, and the different microscopic powers. You can see the nice array that's been made to distribute the expressions that have been exhibited by the antibody staining. And I think this is primarily what a lot of people use them for, is immunohistochemistry today, but they still have lots of value and lots of tools for doing things that are involved in the laboratory. So as we look to expand into where we're going with our lab assays, with lab testing today, with histotechnology, there are lots of things that we're doing with just one tissue block that years ago it was more or less unheard of. For example, we can do IHC, ISH, and CISH all on one tissue block now, provided that it's been fixed and processed correctly and properly. These assays can be done to express the items of interest that we're wanting to use for patient care, perhaps, or for research purposes. Flow cytometry, it uses antibodies, as many of us well know, that may be involved with flow. Microdissection where you can actually take, a group of cells, a specific entity, or even one cell out of a tissue, off of a tissue slide, provided that it's not on a positively charged slide. You can lift these off, mount them on a slide, and then stain them with whatever stain you may wish. It will be a very nice array of sections specific for what you're looking for. And then as we go into the last two things that are really into the molecular realm, genomics and proteomics, and we're seeing more and more of this today, and you're going to continue to see that. You're going to hear about fixing tissues in specific molecular fixatives to preserve things like RNA and DNA that will be used for all types of molecular assays. And we're going to see more and more of the specimen handling in histotechnology be aimed in this direction, because that's just how it's going to be. That's how it really is now in a lot of institutions. So the molecular world is weaving its way into histotechnology, and we just need to kind of be prepared for it. So I think that microtissue arrays are just a neat beginning point to help us to give the needs that are required for better testing and assays for patient care. And then, of course, I've listed your references there. They're very simple, and you can refer to them if you wish. And that's just a very short, brief introduction, perhaps, to tissue microarrays. Perhaps many of you are doing it and have other tips you wish to offer or suggest. They are time-consuming. I like them. I think they're a lot of fun. When I get finished with making one, to me, it's just such a gratification of seeing something assembled together to give a very uniqueness in design and purpose that we haven't had before. They're not relatively new. They've been around a while, but you're going to see more and more about them and hear more and more about them than ever before. So I hope this has given you some insight, some direction, some basics, some ideas, maybe answers some questions that you've had regarding how you make them, what they're used for. If I can be of any help to you, I'm happy to do so. I included my contact information in the second slide of this presentation. So, Alicia, I will turn it back over to you at this point.
Thank you, Lamar. We appreciate a well-delivered presentation on tissue microarrays. I would like to open up the webinar to any questions that the audience may have. If you do have any questions, please type them into the question box, and we will go ahead and address those at this time. Well, the audience is typing in the questions. I just wanted to give the audience some information on our product, which is the Tissue Tech Quick Ray, which is the microarray kit. It's sold in a complete kit with the plunger, the tip, the recipient blocks, and recipient blocks can later be purchased as you go on and build more TMAs. Also, I would like to let the audience know of our next webinar, which is going to be held on March 31st. It's going to be presented by Jason Burrow of Charles Rivers Labs, and the topic is lab safety and what you need to know. We are in the process of getting this and the rest of the webinar series on our website, and I've been told that it should be up no later than Monday. So please check back on Monday and register for the rest of the webinars for the year to come. Lamar, I do have a question for you.
Okay.
To the questions, and the question is, the patient tissue that is used for controls is taken after the case has been read. Are there no legal issues if the case becomes a legal case and the slides and blocks must be submitted to a lawyer and used in court? Will the hospital be held responsible since the patient was never asked if their tissue could be used?
Okay, those are some very good points, and I think that I probably ought to do some research on it, but I think I can give you some answer, and you're welcome to contact me directly by email afterwards if you want. But I think if a pathologist okays for a array block to be made, and you're using patient tissue, yes. In most cases, if it's research-oriented, there has to be and or IRBs so that you are documented and you're covered, so to speak, should this ever go to a court or an attorney's office or whatever. And I think ought to be perhaps something placed in the patient's file or attached to the report that states that a core was taken out of the tissue for whatever purpose or reason. When I make these for special stains, no, I don't really take the tissue that was submitted for diagnostic purposes. These are primarily tissues that are ready to be disposed of, so I don't really use any patient material out of the actual block for any control work. But I think I do need to probably do some research on that just to follow up and see if exactly what would occur or happen. It's a very good question. And if you want to submit that to me in email, I'll be happy to send my research information to you. I hope that helps answer some of it.
Thank you, Lamar. Second question is, do you have any problems with the small 1 millimeter cores washing off the slides during IHC procedures?
I haven't. However, we have not really used very many of the smaller punches. I didn't talk about this in the presentation, but there is a sectioning device that I know many people do use for the smaller cores, such as the one you described. It's known as the tape device. Although I'll be honest, I've never really used it. I've just applied the tissue section to a positive charge slide, and as in with all the slides, whether I come for H&E or special stains or IHC, I always let the slide stand in an upright position to drain the water off of the slide itself and from behind the tissue section. And so by doing that, I let them air dry, probably under a little fan. 30 minutes is a great timing tool, and then dry them in the oven, and it's usually a 60 or 70 degree oven for 20 minutes, and they're ready to go. But there is a tape method for microtomy you can use to hold them on if you have a fear of them coming off. And there's going to be occasions, some of the cores might come off, depending on how old they are and the processing method that they've used, or even if they're getting very thin in the block. You may want to choose to take.
Thank you. I don't see that any other questions are coming in at this point, so I just want to wrap up today's webinar. Enjoy this well-prepared webinar on tissue microarrays. If you have any additional questions after we end this, you can go ahead and send those either to Lamar directly or to myself, and I can forward them to Lamar. Once again, please sign up for next month's webinar on Monday. Thank you for your time.